Nothing cuts deeper than a father's rejection. When 19-year-old Freya's own father sold her to a Viking warrior named Ulrik as punishment for her disobedience, she expected the worst kind of life. Everyone in their coastal village feared Ulrik. His battle scars told stories of violence, and his reputation made grown men look away. Freya was sure she would become his servant or worse. But something unexpected happened. Instead of cruelty, Ulrik showed her kindness. Instead of treating her like property, he treated her with dignity. As the seasons changed at his remote homestead, two wounded souls began to heal together. A girl who had never felt worthy discovered her value. A warrior who had forgotten gentleness remembered how to care. What happens when the most unlikely pair finds that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our worst punishments? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt wind had always carried whispers through the village of Saltmere, but never had those whispers cut as deep as they did the morning Freya's father made his decision. She sat by the small window of their stone cottage, running her fingers along the smooth wooden teeth of her mother's comb, the only thing of beauty she had left from the woman who had loved her unconditionally. Freya's mother had died when the fever swept through 3 winters past, taking with her the only voice that had ever spoken kindly to her daughter. Margaret had seen something precious in Freya that no one else could see, something that had nothing to do with the girl's round face or the way her body had grown soft and full in a world that prized sharp angles and delicate frames. "You have your mother's heart," Margaret used to whisper, braiding Freya's thick brown hair by candlelight. "Kind and strong and true, that matters more than anything else in this world." But Harold, Freya's father, had never shared his wife's vision. A fisherman whose nets brought in less each year, whose back grew more bent with each season. He looked at his daughter and saw only burden. Where Margaret had seen gentle strength, Harold saw weakness. Where she had found beauty in Freya's quiet wisdom, he saw only a mouth to feed and a future without prospects. The morning light filtering through their small window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and Freya watched them with the same fascination she'd had as a child. Simple pleasures had always been enough for her. The way morning light painted everything golden, the sound of waves against the harbour stones, the taste of fresh bread when they could afford it. "Still dreaming, are you?" Harold's voice cut through her reverie like a blade through silk. He stood in the doorway, his weathered face set in the permanent scowl that had deepened since Margaret's death. 19 years old, and still staring out windows like a child. Freya turned from the window, clutching the comb tighter. "I was just watching the sunrise, Father. It's beautiful today. Beautiful." He spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Nothing beautiful about another day with no suitors calling, no prospects in sight. You think beauty puts food on the table or respect in a man's name?" She had heard this speech countless times, but something in his tone today felt different, harder, more final. "Father, I know I'm not what you hoped for, but I try to help. I mend the nets, I tend the garden, You eat more than you're worth," he interrupted, his pale eyes cold as winter sea. "Every day I see other men's daughters married off, bringing honor to their families, bringing connections and dowries and hope for the future. And what do I have? A daughter who scares off every man, who might have shown interest." The words hit her like physical blows, but Freya had learned long ago not to flinch. She had grown thick skin over the years, had taught herself to find worth. In small things, in the herbs she could grow, in the stories she told herself, in the way she could calm crying children with soft songs her mother had taught her. "Perhaps if we moved to a larger town," she suggested quietly, though she knew it was pointless. "Or if I learned a trade." "With what money?" Harold's voice rose, and she could smell the ale on his breath, even from across the room. The drinking. had gotten worse since Margaret died, and with it his bitterness had grown like poison in a wound. "Do you think I'm made of coin? Do you think opportunities grow on trees for fat merchants' daughters, let alone fishermen's failures?" Freya winced at the casual cruelty of his words, but she had long ago stopped expecting kindness from her father. Instead, she focused on the weight of the wooden comb in her hands, remembering how gently her mother had used it, how it had felt like love made tangible. Outside their cottage, the village was stirring to life. She could hear the other fishermen, calling to each other as they prepared their boats, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who respected each other. Harold had once been part of that brotherhood, but years of poor catches and bitter disappointment had isolated him, turned him inward and angry. The widow Astrid mentioned that her nephew in the next village might be looking for a wife, Freya offered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The nephew was 40 years old with 6 children and a reputation for drinking even. More than Harold, Astrid's nephew. Harold laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Even he won't have you, girl. Word travels fast along this coast about the fisherman's daughter who can't catch a husband to save her life." The cruelty in his voice made her throat tighten, but Freya had learned to swallow her tears years ago. She stood carefully, smoothing down her simple brown dress, one of only 2 she owned. "I'll start the morning meal," she said quietly. "Don't bother." Harold turned away from her, but she caught something in his posture that made her stomach clench with unease. "We have a visitor coming today." A visitor? Freya's pulse quickened. They rarely had visitors, and when they did, it usually meant trouble. "Who?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring out the same window she had been watching. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. "Someone who might solve both our problems." Before Freya could ask what he meant, a shadow fell across their doorway. She looked up to see a figure that made her breath catch in her throat, a man so large he had to duck to enter their cottage, with shoulders broad enough to block out the morning light. The Viking had arrived. Ulrik stepped into their humble home, with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to inspiring fear. His hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, braided with leather cords, and his beard was neatly trimmed around a mouth that rarely smiled. But it was his eyes that held Freya's attention, pale blue like winter ice, yet somehow not as cold. As she had expected, he was everything the story said and more, tall as a pine tree, with arms that could crush a man's ribs and hands that had clearly known the weight of battle axes and blood. His leather tunic was simple but well made, and the silver arm rings he wore spoke of successful raids and hard-won victories. But what struck Freya most was not his size or his fearsome reputation. It was the weariness she glimpsed beneath his warrior's facade. Something in his bearing suggested a man who carried heavy burdens, who had seen too much and lost more than he cared to remember. Harold Grimson. Ulrik's voice was deep and measured, with the slight accent that marked him. "As coming from the northern settlements, we have business to discuss." Harold straightened, and Freya could see him struggling between the urge to show respect and his natural inclination toward resentment. "Aye, we do. This is my daughter, Freya." Ulrik's pale eyes settled on her, and Freya felt herself being assessed in a way that made her want to disappear. She had expected his gaze to be contemptuous or predatory, but instead she found something that looked almost like gentleness, as if he were taking care not to frighten a skittish animal. "She is as you described," he said finally, and Freya, who felt her cheeks burn with shame. What had her father told this warrior about her? What promises or warnings had been exchanged? "The terms we discussed remain the same?" Harold's voice carried an eagerness that made Freya's stomach turn cold. "They do." Ulrik reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that caught the morning light, a silver coin, larger than any Freya had ever seen. Payment in full, as agreed. The sight of that coin made everything clear with horrible suddenness. Her father wasn't just entertaining a visitor, he was completing a transaction, and she was the commodity being sold. "Father?" Her voice came, out smaller than she intended, and she cleared her throat to try again. "Father, what is happening here?" Harold wouldn't meet her eyes. "You're going with Ulrik, daughter. He has need of someone to keep his household, and we have need of the coin." The wooden comb slipped from Freya's nerveless fingers, clattering to the stone floor. "You're selling me?" It wasn't a question, but Harold answered anyway. "I'm securing your future, and mine." Freya looked between the two men, her father avoiding her gaze, the Viking watching her with those unsettling pale eyes, and felt something inside her chest crack like ice in spring thaw. She had known her father resented her, had known she was a burden, but she had never imagined he would go this far. "I won't go." The words came out steadier than she felt. "You cannot sell me like livestock." Harold's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You will go, and you will be grateful for it. Do you think you have choices here, girl? Do you think your prospects will improve by staying in this village where everyone knows you for what you are?" "And what am I, father?" The question came, out sharper than she intended, years of swallowed hurt finally finding voice. "A burden," he said without hesitation, and each word fell like a stone. "A disappointment, a daughter who has brought nothing but shame to my name." The silence that followed was thick as morning fog. Freya stood frozen, the full weight of her father's rejection settling over her like a shroud. She had known he resented her, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so coldly in front of a stranger, it cut deeper than she had thought possible. It was Ulrik who broke the silence. "Gather what you wish to bring," he said quietly. "We leave within the hour." Freya looked at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "And if I refuse?" Something flickered across his weathered features, not anger, but something that might have been understanding. "Then you refuse. But consider carefully what you would be refusing to." She glanced around their cottage, at the cold hearth, the sparse furniture, the empty cupboards that spoke of their poverty. Then she looked at her father, who still would not meet her eyes, who had just declared her worthless in front of a stranger. What did she have to lose? With shaking hands, she picked up her mother's wooden comb from the floor. It would be one of the few things she would take with her into whatever future awaited. A reminder of the only love she had ever known. And perhaps the last beautiful thing she would ever own. The morning sun continued to stream through their window, but its warmth no longer reached her. In the space of a few minutes, her entire world had changed, and there would be no going back. The silver coin gleamed in Harold's palm like a piece of captured moonlight, the price of his daughter's freedom and the cost of his own soul. Triditi iron shackles lay coiled on Harold's table like a sleeping serpent, their metal surface dark with age and use. Ulrik's pale eyes moved from the chains to Harold's eager face, and something cold settled in his expression. "You won't be needing those," the Viking said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Harold looked confused, almost disappointed. But surely, for the journey, she might try to run, and a girl her size— "I said you won't be needing them." Ulrik's tone remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. He reached for the shackles and, with movements that spoke of tremendous controlled strength, bent the iron links until they snapped. The sharp crack echoed through the cottage like breaking bones. Freya watched this display with wide eyes, uncertain whether to be relieved or terrified. The ease with which he had destroyed the metal chains suggested power that could just as easily be turned against her. Yet his refusal to use them hinted at a mercy she hadn't dared hope for. "She is not livestock to be chained," Ulrik continued, gathering the broken pieces and dropping them at Harold's feet. "She is coming with me of her own choice." "Choice?" Harold's voice cracked with bitter laughter. "What choice does she have? Look at her! Who else would take such a burden off my hands?" The words hit Freya like physical blows, each one confirming what she had always feared about her father's feelings. She wrapped her arms around herself, clutching the wooden comb until its teeth pressed painfully into her palm. Ulrik turned his attention to her, and she found herself looking into those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see far more than she was. Comfortable, revealing. "The choice is yours, Freya, Harold's daughter. You may come with me to my homestead in the northern mountains, where you will be treated with dignity and given honest work. Or you may remain here in your father's house, but choose freely, without chains or coercion." The cottage fell silent, except for the sound of waves against the harbour stones outside. Freya looked around at the only home she had ever known, the old hearth where her mother used to sit and tell her stories, the small garden where they had grown herbs together, the window where she had spent countless hours dreaming of a different life. Then she looked at her father, who still clutched the silver coin in his fist and would not meet her eyes. The man who had given her life but never love, who saw her as nothing more than a failed investment. "If I stay," she said quietly, "what then? Will anything change?" Harold's silence was answer enough. "And if I go with you?" She addressed Ulrik. Directly, surprised by her own boldness, "What would be expected of me?" "Honest work," he replied without hesitation. "Keeping house, preparing meals, tending to daily tasks. Nothing more, nothing less than what any person of worth deserves." Person of worth. The phrase settled into her heart like a warm stone. When was the last time anyone had spoken of her in terms of worth? "I will come with you," she said, and was surprised to hear her voice steady and clear. Harold looked up sharply, as if he had expected her to refuse and give him reason to force the issue. Good. Then it's settled, but Ulrik was still watching Freya's face. "Are you certain? There will be no returning once we leave this place." Something in his tone suggested he was offering her one final chance to reconsider, as if he understood the magnitude of what she was choosing. But Freya thought of the emptiness that awaited her in this cottage, the years of disappointed sighs and cutting remarks, the slow withering of whatever spirit she had left. "I am certain," she said. She gathered her few possessions quickly, her mother's comb, a change of clothes, a small knife for eating, and a bundle of dried herbs from their garden that might prove useful. Everything that mattered to her in the world fit into a cloth sack no larger than a child's head. As she prepared to leave, the cottage began to fill with curious neighbors drawn by the sight of the massive Viking warrior in their midst. Word traveled fast in Saltmere, and soon a small crowd had gathered outside Harold's door. "Is it true?" asked Astrid the widow, her voice hushed with fascination and horror. "You're truly giving Freya to the Northmen?" "Not giving," Harold corrected. "Puffing up with defensive pride, trading for good silver, and the promise that she'll be properly provided for." Freya caught the way several of the women exchanged glances, looks that spoke of pity mixed with judgment. She had always been the object of whispered conversations, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the dangers of being unmarriageable. Now she would become something else entirely, the girl who was sold to the Vikings. "Poor thing," she heard someone murmur. "God help her soul." But it was young Berger, a girl barely 16 with bright eyes and quick wit, who spoke the words that cut deepest. At least someone wanted her, even if it was for coin. The casual cruelty of youth, delivered without malice but with devastating accuracy. Freya felt her cheeks burn with shame, but when she looked up she found Ulrik watching the crowd with an expression that might have been contempt. "We leave now," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs of the gathered villagers. As they prepared to depart, Freya took one last look around the cottage that had been her prison as much as her home. Her eyes lingered on the small shrine where her mother's memory lived, a carved wooden cross and a pressed flower from Margaret's wedding bouquet. "May I?" she began, then stopped herself. What right did she have to ask for anything? But Ulrik had noticed her hesitation. "What is it?" "My mother's flower," she said quietly. "It's pressed in her prayer book. She always said it would bring me luck." Without a word, he waited while she carefully extracted the delicate pressed bloom from between the pages of the worn leather book. It was faded now, more brown than purple, but it still carried the faint scent of summer meadows and happier times. As she tucked it carefully into her sack, her father spoke for the last time. "Don't think this means I don't care what happens. To you," Freya turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw something that might have been regret flickering in his tired eyes. But it was too little, too late, buried under years of resentment and disappointment. "I know you believe you're doing what's best," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "Perhaps you are." The crowd parted as Ulrik led her toward the harbour, where a sturdy boat waited with two other men, clearly his companions, though. They appeared more farmer than warrior. They nodded respectfully as she approached, offering her a hand up into the vessel with a courtesy she hadn't expected. As the boat pushed away from the dock, Freya watched Saltmere grow smaller behind them. The stone cottages with their thatched roofs, the harbour where her father's boat had brought in fewer fish each year, the market square where she had walked invisible among the other villagers, all of it fading into memory. The last thing she saw clearly was her father, still standing in the doorway of their cottage, the silver coin gleaming in his palm like an accusation. Then the morning mist closed around them, and her old life disappeared, as if it had never been. The boat rocked gently on the waves, and despite her fear, Freya found the motion soothing. She had always loved the sea, even when it brought her father home empty-handed and bitter. There was something eternal about it, something that spoke of possibilities beyond the horizon. "Are you afraid?" Ulrik asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of oars cutting through water. Freya considered the question honestly. "Yes," she admitted, "but not more afraid than I was of staying." He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Fear can be wise if it teaches you to be careful, but it should not rule your life." As they sailed north toward whatever future awaited her, Freya clutched her mother's pressed flower and tried to imagine what it might mean to live without fear ruling every decision. For the first time in years, she dared to hope that perhaps her story was not yet finished, that perhaps it was only just beginning. Behind them, the silver coin caught the morning light one last time before Harold closed his fist around it and turned away from the sea. The transaction was complete, but the true cost would not be known for many days to come. The mountains rose before them like sleeping giants, their peaks wrapped in morning mist and crowned with snow that never fully melted. As their boat navigated the narrow fjord that cut deep into the heart of the northern wilderness, Freya found herself holding her breath at the raw beauty surrounding her. This was nothing like the gentle coastal lands she had known all her life. Here, pine forests clung to steep slopes with desperate determination, and waterfalls cascaded from impossible heights to join the dark water below. The air itself tasted different, cleaner somehow, sharp with the scent of snow and evergreen. Ulrik's homestead sat on a natural shelf of land carved from the mountainside, accessible only by a winding path that switchbacked up from a small wooden dock. As they approached, Freya could see that it was larger than she had expected, not just a single dwelling, but several buildings arranged around a central courtyard, all built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and careful craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Ulrik glanced at her with surprise, as if he had expected fear rather than wonder. "It suits my needs," he said simply, but she caught something in his voice that suggested he was pleased by her reaction. The dock was solid and well-maintained, with iron rings for tying off boats and a small shelter for storing gear. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work, who built things to last. As Ulrik helped her from the boat to the wooden planks, his hands were gentle despite their obvious strength. "The path can be treacherous when wet," he warned, gesturing toward the switchbacking trail that led up to his home. "Stay close and watch your footing." But as they began to climb, Freya found herself surprisingly steady on the steep path. Years of helping her father with his nets and walking the rocky shores had given her a sure step, even if her body carried more weight than others might prefer. The climb took longer than she had expected, and by the time they reached the courtyard, she was breathing heavily, but not discouraged. The exertion felt good after the cramped boat ride, and the mountain air seemed to clear her head of the morning's painful memories. Up close, the homestead was even more impressive. The main hall was built in the old style, with dragon heads, carved into the roof peaks and intricate knotwork decorating the door frames. But there were touches of comfort too. Flower boxes under the windows, well-tended herb gardens, paths lined with smooth river stones. "Someone has cared for this place," Freya observed, running her fingers along the carved woodwork of the nearest doorframe. "My wife," Ulrik said quietly, and something in his tone made Freya's breath catch. She had a gift for making things beautiful. The past tense hung in the air between them like an unfinished song. Freya wanted to ask what had happened, but something in the set of his shoulders warned her away from the subject. Instead, she followed him toward the main hall, where he pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior took her breath away, soaring timber ceilings supported by massive beams, a stone hearth large enough to roast a whole deer, and everywhere the same attention to beautiful detail she had noticed outside. But it was the small touches that told the real story. Woven tapestries hung on the walls, their colors still rich despite obvious age. Carved wooden bowls sat ready on a long oak table, each one shaped by hand with loving attention to detail. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of summer meadows preserved against winter's bite. "She made those," Ulrik said, noticing where her gaze had settled on the tapestries. "Took her 3 winters to finish. The largest one." Freya moved closer to examine the work, marveling at the intricate patterns and the skill required to create something so beautiful. She was very talented. "Aye." His voice carried a weight of grief that made her heart ache. "In sympathy. Very talented and very kind." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of shared understanding. They were both familiar with loss, with the empty spaces left by people who had loved them. "Where will I sleep?" Freya asked finally, partly to break the silence, and partly because she genuinely needed to know. Ulrik gestured toward a smaller door at the far end of the hall. "There is a room prepared for you. It has its own hearth and a window that looks toward the sunrise." He led her to the room, and Freya was amazed by what she found. It was larger than the entire cottage she had shared with her father, with a proper bed covered in furs and wool blankets, a sturdy table and chair, and shelves built into the walls for her possessions, though she had pitifully few to fill them. Most surprising of all was the wooden bowl sitting on the table, clearly carved by hand and polished to a warm glow. It was simple but beautiful, practical yet somehow precious. "You made this for me?" she asked, lifting the bowl and marveling at its perfect weight in her hands. Ulrik nodded, and she thought she detected a slight flush of color in his cheeks. Everyone deserves to eat from something made with care. The kindness of the gesture, the thoughtfulness behind it, nearly brought tears to her eyes. When was the last time anyone had made something specifically for her? When had anyone considered her comfort or dignity worth such effort? "Thank you," she said, and meant it more deeply than he could possibly know. "There are clothes in the chest," he continued, his manner becoming brisk, as if embarrassed by her gratitude. "My wife was—" He paused, seemed to reconsider his words. "They should fit well enough until we can arrange for new ones to be made." Freya opened the wooden chest and found several dresses in good repair, made of sturdy wool in colors that would complement her brown hair and fair skin. They were clearly the work of skilled hands, and she could imagine the woman who had worn them, someone who had cared about beauty even in practical things. "I cannot wear her clothes," she said quietly. "It wouldn't be right." Ulrik was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those pale blue eyes. "She would want them to be useful," he said finally. "Astrid was practical above all things. She would not want good cloth to go to waste when someone had need of it." Astrid, now the unnamed wife, had a name, and somehow that made her feel more real, more present in this place that still carried her touch. "Then I will wear them with gratitude," Freya said, "and I will take good care of them." "The evening meal will be ready in an hour," Ulrik said, moving toward the door. "Rest if you wish, or explore the homestead. You are free to go where you will." Free. The word settled into her heart like a warm coal. When was the last time she had been free to simply wander, to explore, to satisfy her own curiosity without fear of criticism or punishment? After he left, Freya sat on the edge of the bed, her bed, and tried to process the enormity of what had happened. This morning she had awakened as her father's unwanted burden, a disappointment destined for a life of increasing bitterness and shame. Now she sat in a beautiful room, with a window that caught the afternoon light, surrounded by comfort she had never dared dream of. She rose and moved to the window, pushing open the shutters to look out over the valley below. The view was breathtaking, endless. Forests stretching toward distant peaks, a silver stream threading through meadows that would be green with spring grass in a few months. This was a place where a person could breathe, could think, could perhaps even dream of better things. As she stood there, she became aware of sounds from elsewhere in the homestead. The rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood, the gentle lowing of cattle, the everyday sounds of a working farm. But there was no harshness in these sounds, no anger or frustration, just the steady rhythm of purposeful work done by competent hands. From her window, she could see Ulrik working in the courtyard below, splitting logs with smooth, efficient strokes. His massive frame moved with surprising grace, and she found herself fascinated by the controlled power he displayed. This was clearly a man accustomed to physical labor, but unlike her father, he seemed to take satisfaction in his work rather than resentment. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and caught sight of her in the window. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the courtyard, and Freya felt something flutter in her chest. Not fear, as she might have expected, but something warmer and more complicated. He raised his hand in a simple gesture of acknowledgement, and she found herself waving back before she quite realized what she was doing. Then, as if embarrassed by the moment of connection, she stepped back from the window. But the feeling lingered, a sense that perhaps, in this beautiful remote place, she might find something she had never had before. Not just safety or shelter, but something that looked remarkably like home. The wooden bowl sat on her table, catching the afternoon light and reminding her of the care that had gone into its making. Someone had thought her worthy of such consideration, worthy of beauty and comfort and dignity. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Freya allowed herself to hope that perhaps her father had been wrong about her worth. Perhaps there was more to her story than disappointment and failure. Perhaps, in this place of mountain air and careful kindness, she might discover who she truly was, when no one was telling her she wasn't enough. The battle-axe leaned against, the woodshed like a sleeping dragon, its broad blade scarred with the memories of countless conflicts. But now, instead of cleaving through enemy shields, it split seasoned pine for the evening fire. Freya watched from the kitchen window as Ulrik worked, noting how naturally the weapon sat in his hands, despite its transformation from instrument of war to tool of domestic necessity. 3 days had passed since her arrival, and already she was beginning to understand the rhythms of this mountain homestead. Ulrik rose before dawn to tend the animals, a small herd of hardy cattle, several goats and chickens that seemed impervious to the highland cold. He worked steadily through the day, maintaining buildings, chopping wood, checking trap lines, and performing the 100 small tasks that kept a remote holding functioning through the harsh seasons. What surprised Freya was how naturally she had begun to fit into this routine. Without being asked, she had taken over the preparation of meals, finding the kitchen surprisingly well stocked with preserved meats, dried vegetables, and herbs that filled the air with promise. Ulrik ate her simple fare without comment, but she caught him glancing at her with something that might have been approval when he thought she wasn't looking. This morning, she had woken early and prepared a more elaborate breakfast than usual, fresh. Bread baked in the stone oven, eggs from the chickens gathered warm from their nests, and a porridge made rich with milk from the goats and sweetened with dried berries she had found in the storage rooms. "You did not need to go to such trouble," Ulrik said when he came in from his morning chores, but his tone suggested he was pleased rather than critical. "It was no trouble," Freya replied, and realized with some surprise that she meant it. For the first time in years, preparing food felt like an act of care rather than grudging obligation. "I enjoy cooking when I have good ingredients to work with." He nodded thoughtfully, settling at the long table that dominated the main hall. Astrid felt the same way. She said that feeding people well was one of the ways we show love. The mention of his wife no longer sent uncomfortable silence rippling between them. Over the past few days, Ulrik had begun to speak of Astrid more freely, sharing small memories that painted the picture of a woman who had brought warmth and beauty to this mountain refuge. "Tell me about her," Freya said, settling across from him with her own bowl of porridge. The words came out before she could second-guess herself, but Ulrik didn't seem offended by her curiosity. "She was small," he said after a moment, his pale eyes distant with memory. "Barely came to my shoulder, with dark hair that curled like smoke and hands that could make beauty from the simplest things." He gestured toward the tapestries that warmed the stone walls. "She said this place needed softness to balance the hardness of the mountains." She was right, Freya observed, looking around at the touches that had transformed what could have been a stark warrior's dwelling into something that felt like home. "Did she come from the village?" "No." Ulrik's expression grew more complex. "She came from the south, from lands where the growing season is longer and the winters less harsh. Her father was a merchant who traded with our settlement. She chose to come north with me, though everyone said she was too delicate for this life. But she proved them wrong. Aye, that she did. For 8 winters she made this place sing with her laughter." His voice grew quieter. "Then the fever took her, along with our unborn child. She died in my arms during the worst blizzard in memory, and I could not even dig a proper grave until spring came." The raw pain in his voice made Freya's heart ache. She could imagine this giant of a man holding his dying wife, powerless against the enemy he could not fight with axe or sword. "I am sorry," she said simply, because sometimes simple words carried the most truth. "She would have liked you," Ulrik said quietly. "Astrid had a way of seeing the good in people, of understanding their hearts. She would have seen what I see. And what do you see?" The question slipped out before Freya could stop it, born of a lifetime of being told she was lacking in every way that mattered. Ulrik looked at her directly, his pale eyes serious. "I see a woman who makes bread with the same care others reserve for precious things, who speaks gently to frightened animals and hums while she works, who has kindness in her heart despite having received little of it herself." The words hit Freya like warm sunlight after a long winter. No one had ever described her in such terms, had ever suggested she possessed qualities worth valuing. She felt tears prick at her eyes and looked down at her bowl to hide them. "Your father was a fool," Ulrik added with quiet conviction. "Any man who could not see your worth was blind to what matters most." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, but something had shifted between them. A bridge had been built across the space that separated their experiences, connecting his grief with her hope in ways that neither had expected. After breakfast, Ulrik prepared to check the traplines that provided much of their winter meat. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked. "The paths can be treacherous alone, but with two people they are manageable, and the views are worth the climb." Freya looked out at the mountain slopes, where the morning light was painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. She had never been much beyond the borders of Saltmere, had never seen the world from such heights. "I would like that very much," she said. The climb was steep and challenging, but Ulrik set a pace that pushed her without overwhelming her capabilities. He pointed out landmarks as they went, a distinctive rock formation that marked the boundary of his land, a grove of ancient pines that provided shelter for deer, a spring that never froze even in the deepest winter. "How long have you lived here?" Freya asked as they paused to rest at a scenic overlook. 12 winters, he replied. "I came here after my time in the wars, looking for peace and solitude. Found more than I bargained for when I met Astrid. You were a warrior in the raids?" His expression grew somber. "Aye, though not by choice. My Jarl demanded it, and a man who refused faced exile or death. I did what was required, but I took no joy in it." Freya studied his profile as he gazed out over the valley below. "Is that why you came here? To escape that life?" "Partly." He was quiet for a long moment. "There are things a man does in war that follow him always. I thought if I could build something instead of destroying, if I could create a place of peace and beauty, perhaps the scales might balance." The honesty in his words touched something deep in Freya's heart. Here was a man who had known violence but chosen gentleness, who had seen the worst of human nature but still believed in the possibility of goodness. They continued their circuit of the traplines, finding 2 rabbits and a ptarmigan. Enough. Meat for several good meals. Ulrik showed her how to reset the snares, how to read the signs that indicated where game was likely to pass. "You have quick hands," he observed as she successfully reset a trap under his guidance, "and a good eye for detail." The simple praise warmed her more than it should have. She was not accustomed to being complimented for her competence, to having her abilities acknowledged and valued. As they made their way back toward the homestead, the afternoon light slanting long across the snow, Freya found herself walking with more confidence than she had felt in years. The mountain air filled her lungs. The exertion made her feel strong and capable, and the man beside her treated her as if her company had value. "Thank you," she said as they approached the familiar buildings of home. "For what?" "For bringing me with you today, for showing me all of this." She gestured at the magnificent landscape surrounding them. "I have never seen the world from such a height." Ulrik smiled, the first full, genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his weathered features completely. "There is much more to see when you are ready for it, when you are ready not if, but when." As if he believed she would grow strong enough, brave enough to climb even higher peaks and see even more wonders. That evening, as they shared the rabbits she had helped catch, cooked in a stew fragrant with herbs from Astrid's carefully tended Garden? Freya felt something she had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. Outside, the mountain winds howled around the sturdy walls of their refuge, but inside, all was warmth and peace. The fire crackled in the great hearth, the oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the carved beams, and across the table Ulrik cleaned and oiled his tools with the same care he brought to everything else. For the first time in her life, Freya understood what it meant to feel truly at home, not just sheltered but welcomed, not just fed but nourished, not just tolerated but valued. As she prepared for sleep that night, she held her mother's wooden comb and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had brought her to this place. The girl who had awakened in her father's cottage that morning seemed like a stranger now, someone small and frightened and convinced of her own worthlessness. The woman who climbed into the comfortable bed, surrounded by beautiful things and the echoes of gentle words, was someone entirely different. Someone who was beginning to understand that perhaps she had always been worthy of kindness. She just needed to find the right person to offer it. The faded marriage braid lay coiled in Ulrik's massive palm like a sleeping snake made of silk and memory. Freya had found it quite by accident while organizing the storage room, tucked away in a wooden box beneath carefully folded linens that still held the faint scent of lavender. The moment she lifted it into the lamplight, she knew what it was, and knew she had no right to touch it. "I'm sorry," she said quickly when Ulrik appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of her surprised intake of breath. "I didn't mean to. I was just organizing the linens, and it's all right." His voice was gentle as he took the braid from her nerveless fingers. "It's only hair, after all. Astrid would have laughed to see me keeping it like some precious relic." But Freya could see the lie in his careful handling of the silken strands, in the way his thumb traced the intricate weaving pattern that had once bound his wife's dark locks. This was more than hair. It was a physical piece of the woman who had transformed a warrior's retreat into a home filled with laughter and love. "She wore this at your wedding?" Freya asked softly. "Aye." Ulrik settled beside her on the storage room's single stool, the braid still cradled in his hands. Her hair was so long it reached past her waist when unbound. She spent the morning of our wedding weaving flowers into this braid, mountain laurel and wild roses she had gathered herself. The image painted itself vividly in Freya's mind. A small, dark-haired woman with nimble fingers, preparing for the most important day of her life with the same attention to beauty she brought to everything else. "Tell me about her," Freya said, echoing her request from the breakfast table days before. But this time, the question carried different weight, spoken in the intimate space where Astrid's possessions lay carefully preserved. Ulrik was quiet for so long that Freya thought he might not answer. Then, as if making a decision that surprised even him, he began to speak. "I first saw her in the market at Eriksfjord. She was bargaining with Olaf the blacksmith over the price of iron needles, standing no taller than his elbow, but arguing with the confidence of a woman twice her size." A smile ghosted across his weathered features. Olaf was known for driving hard bargains, but she had him laughing and agreeing to her terms within minutes. She was persuasive. She was everything I was not, quick with words, comfortable among people, able to find joy in simple things. I had just returned from 3 years of raiding, my heart heavy with things I had seen and done. When I looked at her, it was like seeing sunlight after a long winter. Freya felt a flutter of something that might have been jealousy, though she had no right to such feelings. This woman had been loved completely, had known what it felt like to be chosen and cherished. The contrast to her own life was stark and painful. Did she know what kind of man you had been, in the raids? Aye, she knew. Ulrik's voice carried a weight of old shame. I told her everything before I asked for her hand. I wanted no lies between us, no hidden truths to poison what we might build together, and she accepted you anyway. She said that a man's past matters less than his present choices, that every day we wake with the chance to be better than we were the day before. His thumb continued its gentle tracing of the braided hair. She saw possibility where others saw only a blood-stained warrior growing old before his time. The words settled into Freya's heart like seeds in fertile ground. Every day we wake with the chance to be better than we were the day before. What a magnificent way to view life, not as a fixed story already written, but as a tale still being told. She sounds like a wise woman, wise and kind and brave. Ulrik carefully rewound the braid and placed it back in its wooden box. She left everything she knew to come to this remote place with me. Her family thought she was mad to tie herself to a Viking warrior, especially one seeking to disappear into the mountains. But she was happy here, happier than I deserved. The admission came out rough with emotion. She made friends with the eagles that nested in our high peaks, learned to weave cloth from the wool of our mountain sheep. She planted gardens that somehow thrived despite the short growing season, and filled this hall with music and laughter. Freya could imagine it. This stern, weathered man transformed by the presence of the small, dynamic woman who had chosen to love him despite his violent past. She could picture evening meals filled with conversation and gentle teasing, winter nights when stories and songs drove back the darkness. The fever came in her 6th winter here, Ulrik continued, his voice growing quiet. She had been carrying our child for 4 months, so proud of the new life growing within her. When the sickness started, she kept saying she would be fine, that she was too stubborn to let a little fever stop her from bringing our baby into the world. But it wasn't a little fever. No. The single word carried a universe of pain. For 3 days I watched her burn with it, helpless to do anything but hold cold cloths to her forehead and whisper useless prayers to gods who seemed to have forgotten us both. She died on the 4th morning, just as the sun was rising over the eastern peaks. Freya's throat tightened with sympathetic grief. She had lost her mother, but not like this. Not while fighting to save 2 lives at once. Not while the person who loved her most was forced to watch helplessly. I buried her in the grove where she gathered her wedding flowers, Ulrik said. Under the stone cairn you can see from the kitchen window. Sometimes I still catch myself listening for her voice. On the wind, the silence that followed was full of the weight of loss and the ache of memory. Freya wanted to offer comfort, but knew that no words could ease the kind of grief that lived in a man's bones. Instead, she did what felt most natural. She reached out and covered his massive hand with her smaller one. The gesture was simple, offering nothing but the warmth of human contact and the wordless assurance that he was not alone with his sorrow. To her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up and let their fingers intertwine. A connection that spoke of understanding rather than romance, of one wounded soul recognizing another. She would have liked you, he said after a moment, echoing his words from the breakfast table. Astrid had a gift for seeing the strength in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. I don't feel very strong, Freya admitted. Most days I feel like I'm barely holding myself together. That's what strength is, Ulrik replied with quiet certainty. Not the absence of fear or doubt, but the choice to keep moving forward despite them. You left everything you knew to come to this strange place with a man you had every reason to fear. If that isn't courage, I don't know what is. His words painted her decision in colors she had never seen before. In her own mind, she had simply chosen the lesser of 2 evils, had fled one form of misery for what might prove to be another. But viewed through his eyes, her choice looked like bravery. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if things had been different, she said. If my father had loved me, if someone in Saltmere had wanted to marry me despite my appearance, if I had never needed to make the choice at all. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the fever had never come, if Astrid and our child had lived to see this spring. Ulrik's fingers tightened gently around hers, but wondering changes nothing. We can only work with the life we have been given. Outside the storage room, the sounds of the homestead continued. Wind in the eaves, the soft lowing of cattle settling for the night, the distant call of a night bird hunting in the darkness. These were the sounds of a life being lived, of a place where people worked and rested and found meaning in simple things. "I should let you rest," Freya said, though she was reluctant to break the connection between them. "Perhaps we both should rest." But Ulrik made no move to rise from the stool, and his hand remained warm and solid around hers. "Are you lonely?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, too personal and too direct for someone in her position to ask. "Every day," he answered without hesitation. "But less so since you arrived." The honesty in his admission made her breath catch. She had been here only a week, had barely begun to understand the rhythms of his life. Yet somehow her presence had made a difference. He was willing to acknowledge. "I am lonely too," she admitted. "I've been lonely for so long, I almost forgot what it felt like not to be." And now, she considered the question seriously, testing her feelings like someone checking the tenderness of a healing wound. "Now I remember what it's like to have someone notice if I'm happy or sad, to have someone care whether I eat enough or sleep well. It's frightening in a way." Why frightening? Because it could end. Because caring about someone means having something to lose. She looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt, despite the impossibility of it all. "I'm not sure I'm brave enough for that kind of risk." "Neither was I," Ulrik said quietly. "When Astrid died, I swore I would never again let anyone that close to my heart. The pain of losing her nearly destroyed me. But you're willing to try again." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making a decision that would change everything. "I'm beginning to think that a life without the risk of love isn't really a life at all." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Freya felt her heart racing, felt the magnitude of the moment settling around them like snow that would reshape the landscape forever. But before either of them could say more, a sound from outside made them both freeze, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching at speed, their hoofbeats echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. Ulrik was on his feet instantly, his warrior's instincts sharp, despite the gentle man he had become. "Stay here," he commanded, reaching for the battle axe that was never far from his side. "What is it?" Freya asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Trouble," he said grimly, and strode toward the door to face whatever darkness was riding toward their mountain sanctuary. The bundle of healing herbs hung from Freya's belt like a talisman of newfound purpose, their aromatic weight a constant reminder of the skill she was discovering within herself. Over the past weeks, she had transformed the small garden behind the kitchen into something that would have made Astrid proud. Rows of carefully tended medicinal plants that thrived despite the mountain's harsh conditions. The riders had proven to be traders, not raiders, 3 weather-beaten men seeking shelter from an unexpected spring storm. But their arrival had shaken something loose in both Freya and Ulrik, a recognition that their mountain sanctuary was not as isolated from the world as they had allowed themselves to believe. Old Bjorn cut his hand badly on a broken pot. One of the traders had explained after accepting Ulrik's offer of hospitality. "The wound festers despite our efforts to clean it. We hoped you might know of someone with healing skills." Freya had stepped forward before she quite realized what she was doing. "May I look at it?" The traders had exchanged skeptical glances. She was clearly no wise woman or trained healer, but desperation had made them willing to accept help from any source. When she examined Bjorn's swollen, infected hand, her mother's half-remembered lessons had come flooding back. "The wound needs to be cleaned properly and packed with healing herbs," she had said with more confidence than she felt. "I can help if you'll let me." What followed had been one of the most satisfying experiences of Freya's life. Using supplies. From Astrid's well-stocked stillroom, she had created a poultice of honey, crushed garlic and meadowsweet that drew the poison from Bjorn's wound. Within hours, the angry red inflammation had begun to subside. "Where did you learn such skills?" Ulrik had asked later, after the traders had left with profuse thanks and promises to spread word of the helpful woman in the mountains. "My mother," Freya had replied, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. "I thought I had forgotten most of what she taught me, but watching Bjorn's pain, it all came back." Now, 3 days later, she knelt in her thriving garden, harvesting the last of the season's chamomile, and marveling at how much her life had changed. The shy, worthless girl her father had sold away was gone, replaced by a woman who woke each morning with purpose, and ended each day with the satisfaction of meaningful work. "The garden looks like it's been here for years," Ulrik observed, approaching with his usual careful grace. In his hands, he carried a wooden box that had clearly been crafted with the same attention to detail as everything else he made. "It wants to grow," Freya replied, sitting back on her heels and wiping dirt from her hands. "Plants are like people, I think. Give them the right conditions, and they'll surprise you with their strength." Ulrik smiled at her observation, that full, transforming expression that made him look years younger. Astrid used to say something very similar. She claimed that anything would thrive if you gave it enough love and attention. The mention of his wife no longer brought the sharp pang of awkwardness it once had. Over the weeks, Astrid had become a comforting presence in their conversations, her memory woven into the fabric of daily life rather than locked away in painful silence. "I brought you something," Ulrik said, offering her the wooden box. "For your healing supplies." Freya accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. Like everything he made, the box was both beautiful and practical, with clever compartments for organizing different herbs and tools. The wood glowed with careful sanding and oiling, and her initials had been carved into the lid with delicate precision. "It's magnificent," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "You made this for me?" "A skilled healer deserves proper tools," he replied, but she caught the flush of color that warmed his cheeks. "And perhaps it's time someone new had beautiful things made especially for them." The implication in his words made her heart race. She looked up from the box to find him watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Something warmer than mere kindness, deeper than simple gratitude. "Ulrik," she began, then found herself without words adequate to the moment. "I know," he said quietly. "I know the complications, the differences between us. I know that I am nearly twice your age, that my past is written in blood and yours in gentleness. I know that you came here as a purchased woman, not a willing bride." Each word hit like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their immediate impact. Freya felt her carefully constructed sense of security wobble, threatened by possibilities too large and frightening to fully contemplate. "But," Ulrik continued, settling onto the ground beside her with surprising grace for such a large man, "I also know that when I watch you tend your garden, I remember what it feels like to hope for the future. When I see you healing others, I remember that hands can create as well as destroy. When you laugh at something simple and beautiful, I remember why life is worth living." Freya's throat tightened with emotion. "You're speaking of love." "Aye," he said simply. "I'm speaking of love." The word hung between them like a bird that might fly away if either of them moved too quickly. Freya held the beautiful box against her chest and tried to understand how her life had led to this moment, sitting in a mountain garden with a man who spoke of loving her despite every reason to find her unworthy. "I don't know how to be loved," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm capable of loving properly in return." Neither did I, before Astrid. Love isn't something we know by instinct. It's something we learn by doing, by choosing to care more about someone else's happiness than our own comfort. And you would choose that? With me? Ulrik reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and cupped her face in one massive hand. His palm was rough, with calluses but infinitely gentle, and she found herself leaning into the touch like a flower turning towards sunlight. "I have been half alive since Astrid died," he said quietly. "Existing but not truly living, maintaining this place but not making it a home again. You have changed that, Freya. You have brought light back to these halls and warmth back to my heart." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but for once they were not born of sadness. "I was nothing before I came here. A burden, a disappointment, a woman no one wanted." "You were a woman who had not yet found where she belonged," Ulrik corrected gently. "A healer without patience to tend, a nurturer without a garden to grow, a heart full of love with no one worthy to receive it." His words painted her past in colors she had never seen, transformed her years of loneliness into a waiting period rather than a condemnation. Could it be that simple? Could all those years of feeling unwanted have been preparation for this moment, this place, this man who saw value where others had seen only failure? "The traders will spread word about your healing skills," Ulrik said, shifting to a different subject as if sensing she needed time to process his declarations. "Others will come seeking help. Are you prepared for that?" The practical question grounded her, gave her something concrete to consider. "I think so. The still room has everything I need, and each person I help teaches me more about the craft." "Good. This mountain is isolated, but it sits on one of the few safe passes through this range. We'll see more travelers as word spreads, especially those injured or sick who cannot find help elsewhere. You don't mind having strangers in your sanctuary?" Ulrik was quiet for a moment, gazing out over the valley that spread below their mountain home. "I came here seeking solitude, but I've learned that true peace isn't found in isolation. It's found in purpose. If we can offer healing and shelter to those who need it, perhaps we can make something meaningful from our lives. We." The simple pronoun carried the weight of shared dreams and common purpose. Freya felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she had never experienced before. "I would like that," she said, "to help people, to make a difference in their lives." "Then we'll prepare together. We'll expand the still room, lay in more supplies, perhaps even build a proper guest house for travelers who need extended care." As he spoke, Freya could see the vision taking shape. Their mountain homestead transformed into a place of healing and hope, a sanctuary not just for their own hearts, but for any who needed refuge from a harsh world. "There's something else," Ulrik said, his tone growing more serious. "The traders brought news from the lowlands. There's been raiding along the coast, villages burned and people taken. The danger may eventually reach even here." A chill ran down Freya's spine. "Raiders? Vikings like—" She caught herself before finishing the comparison. "Like I used to be," Ulrik completed grimly. "Yes, but these aren't men seeking a new life or fleeing old crimes. These are killers and slavers, the worst kind of raiders. They leave nothing but ash and sorrow in their wake. Would they come here? Perhaps. If they learn of this place, if they think we have anything worth taking." His expression hardened in a way she hadn't seen since her first day. "Which is why we must be prepared to defend ourselves, if necessary." The thought of violence intruding on their peaceful sanctuary made Freya's stomach clench with fear. But beneath the fear, she felt something else, a fierce determination to protect what they were building together. "Teach me," she said quietly. "Teach you what?" "How to defend myself, how to defend our home. I won't be helpless if danger comes." Ulrik studied her face for a long moment, perhaps seeing something there that surprised him. "It won't be easy. Combat training is harsh, and you'll be learning skills no one hopes to use." "Nothing worth having comes easily," Freya replied, unconsciously echoing lessons learned in her healing work. "If protecting this place, protecting you, requires me to learn to fight, then I'll learn." The pride in his expression made her feel 10 feet tall. "Very well, we'll start tomorrow after you finish your morning work in the garden. But first—" He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her gently to her feet. "First, we finish preparing for winter and hope that peace lasts long enough for us to enjoy what we're building." As they walked back toward the hall together, the wooden box of healing supplies clutched in her arms, and his massive presence warm and reassuring beside her. Freya marveled at the strange turns her life had taken. Months ago, she had been a burden endured by a bitter father, a woman considered unfit for any man's love. Now she was a healer, whose skills brought hope to suffering people, a partner in creating something beautiful and meaningful, and, perhaps, most miraculous of all, a woman loved for exactly who she was. The future remained uncertain, shadowed by potential dangers and complicated by questions that had no easy answers. But for the first time in her life, Freya faced that uncertain future with hope instead of fear. She had found her place in the world, and she would fight to keep it. The bloodied Viking ring lay in the mud like a fallen star, its silver surface dark with gore, and its intricate dragon head design unmistakable even in the dim morning light. Freya stared at it with growing horror, her mind struggling to process what its presence meant in the ruins of their ransacked homestead. "Why do you want him?" she demanded. "If he rejected the throne once, why would he want it now?" Magnus leaned back against a fallen log, his pale eyes glittering with ambition and malice. "Because his brother Hakon has proven himself unworthy of the crown. 3 years of his rule have brought nothing but disaster, failed harvests, lost battles, rebellion in the outer provinces. The people whisper that the gods are displeased with their choice of king. And you think Ulrik would be better? I think Ulrik would be grateful to those who helped him reclaim his birthright," Magnus replied, with calculated honesty. "Grateful enough to reward his supporters with land, titles, and power. I have no love for your mountain hermit, but I have great love for what he could give me." The political maneuvering behind his words made Freya sick. These men cared nothing for Ulrik's happiness or the good of his people. They saw only an opportunity to advance their own fortunes by putting a reluctant prince on a throne he had already rejected. "He won't come alone," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Ulrik has allies, men who served with him in the old days." "Does he?" Magnus looked genuinely curious. "I wonder. 12 years is a long time to maintain old loyalties, especially when those loyalties cost a man his position and prospects. How many of his former companions do you think have made their peace with King Hakon by now?" The question hit closer to the mark than Freya wanted to admit. In all her time with Ulrik, she had seen no evidence of contact with former allies, no letters exchanged or visitors from his past. His isolation seemed complete, his bridges to the old life thoroughly burned. "He's not the same man who walked away from that throne." She tried one more time. 12 years have changed him. He's found peace, purpose, a different kind of life. "Men don't change as much as they like to believe," Magnus replied, with the certainty of someone who had never tried to transform himself. "A warrior remains a warrior. A prince remains a prince. Strip away the simple clothes and humble tasks, and I guarantee you'll find the same man who once commanded armies and sat in judgment over lesser lords." His words stirred uncomfortable memories. Moments when Ulrik's natural authority had shone through his chosen humility, times when his bearing or speech had revealed the noble blood he tried so hard to forget. Even in exile, even in love, perhaps. Some things could never be fully set aside. Besides, Magnus continued, warming to his theme, what has his peaceful life really brought him? A dead wife, an empty hall, and now a woman who will die unless he proves he still remembers how to be the prince he was born to be. The casual cruelty of the threat made Freya's blood run cold. You would kill me to make a political point? I would kill anyone necessary to achieve my goals, he replied without emotion. But I don't think it will come to that. Love makes men do foolish things, and your Ulrik loves you enough to be very foolish indeed. As if summoned by his words, a horn call echoed across the valley, long, mournful, and unmistakably familiar. Freya's heart leaped with desperate hope, even as her mind filled with terror. Ulrik had found them, but he was walking into a trap, designed specifically to exploit his feelings for her. Magnus smiled as he heard the horn. Right on schedule. I was beginning to worry he might have grown too soft for heroics. The raiders moved with practiced efficiency, taking positions behind rocks and trees that would give them clear shots at anyone approaching their campfire. Freya found herself tied to a stake in the center of their makeshift fortress, positioned where she would be clearly visible to anyone coming to rescue her. Now we see what kind of man your gentle giant really is, Magnus murmured, checking his weapons one final time. Prince or peasant, hero or coward. The next hour will tell us everything we need to know. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, Freya closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Not for her own safety, she had accepted that her fate was probably sealed, but for Ulrik's wisdom. Let him be smart enough to see the trap, clever enough to find a way to save them both without falling into Magnus's web of manipulation. But even as she prayed, she knew the truth that Magnus had already grasped. Love would make Ulrik reckless, would drive him to attempt a rescue, regardless of the odds or the consequences. The man who had walked away from a throne rather than compromise his principles would risk everything for the woman who had brought light back to his darkened world. The bloodied ring caught the firelight once more as Magnus slipped it onto his own finger like a trophy. In that moment, Freya understood that they were not just fighting for her freedom or even Ulrik's life. They were fighting for the right to choose their own destiny, to live the quiet life of love and purpose they had built together in their mountain sanctuary, a life that might end tonight in this remote valley, sacrificed to the ambitions of men who saw people as nothing more than pieces on a board game of power and politics. The footsteps were very close now, and Magnus raised his hand to signal his men. The trap was set. The bait was in place, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, the man she loved was walking toward what might be his doom. Freya bit back a cry of warning, knowing that any sound from her would only make things worse. All she could do now was watch and pray, and hope that the gentle warrior she had come to love still remembered enough of the prince he used to be to survive what was coming. The future of everything they had built together hung in the balance, and the outcome would be decided in the next few heartbeats. Why do you want him? She demanded. If he rejected the throne once, why would he want it now? The carved wooden wolf sat in Ulrik's palm like a talisman of purpose, its surface worn. Smooth by decades of handling, he had carried it through countless battles, a reminder of the pack loyalty that bound warriors together and the fierce protectiveness that defined a true leader. Now, crouched in the darkness above Magnus's camp, he drew strength from its familiar weight. 3 hours had passed since he discovered the destruction of his homestead and found Freya's trail. 3 hours of tracking through mountain terrain he knew better than any living soul, of calling upon skills he had hoped never to need again. The gentle farmer who tended gardens and split firewood was gone, replaced by the warrior prince who had once commanded the respect of hardened veterans, but this time he fought alone. From his vantage point on the rocky slope, Ulrik could see the entire raider camp laid out below him like a military exercise. 5 men, not counting Magnus himself, professional. Killers who had positioned themselves with tactical precision around their captive. Freya sat bound to a stake in the center of their perimeter, clearly visible in the firelight and just as clearly bait for the trap they expected him to spring. They had chosen their ground well, Ulrik admitted grudgingly. The narrow valley offered limited approaches, and the surrounding slopes provided excellent fields of fire for archers. Any frontal assault would be suicide, and they had undoubtedly counted on his emotional attachment to Freya making him attempt exactly that kind of desperate charge. But they had made one crucial error in their planning. They had underestimated both who they were dealing with and how much he had learned during his years of exile. The wooden wolf caught the moonlight as Ulrik turned it slowly in his fingers, remembering lessons learned in blood and brotherhood during the campaigns of his youth. A pack fought together, covered each other's weaknesses, struck with coordinated precision. But a lone wolf had different advantages: speed, stealth, unpredictability, and the desperate cunning of the outnumbered. Moving with practiced silence, he began to circle the camp, studying each raider's position and equipment. Magnus's men were competent but not exceptional, the kind of warriors who relied more on intimidation than skill, more on numbers than individual prowess. They expected their quarry to announce himself with horn calls and dramatic gestures, to play by the rules of heroic confrontation. They had no idea they were hunting a man who had spent 12 years learning entirely different rules. The first sentry died without a sound, Ulrik's knife finding the gap between helmet and mail shirt with surgical precision. The second managed a half shout before a thrown stone crushed his windpipe, the sound lost in the crackling of the campfire. By the time the remaining raiders realized they were under attack, their numbers had been cut in half. "Stand and fight, you coward!" Magnus roared into the darkness, his sword gleaming as he whirled to face threats that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Face me like the prince you claim to be." From the shadows, Ulrik smiled without humor. Let Magnus rage and posture. Angry. Men made mistakes, and mistakes could be exploited by someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. The third raider fell to an arrow shot from impossible range, the shaft appearing in his chest as if conjured from thin air. The fourth died trying to reach his horse, cut down by a figure that emerged from the darkness like death itself before melting back into shadow. That left only Magnus and one remaining man, better odds than Ulrik had dared hope for, but still dangerous enough to require careful handling. Freya's life hung in the balance, and one wrong move could cost her everything. "You always were too clever for your own good," Magnus called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "But cleverness won't save your woman. Show yourself, or I'll cut her throat and be done with it." The threat sent ice through Ulrik's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Magnus needed him alive. A dead prince was useless for political manipulation. The threat against Freya was real, but it was also a sign of desperation from a man whose carefully laid trap was falling apart around him. "I'm here, Magnus," Ulrik said finally, stepping into the circle of firelight with his hands conspicuously empty. "Let's finish this." The Jarl's pale eyes glittered with savage satisfaction. "There's the prince I remember. I was beginning to think mountain air had made you soft." "Perhaps it has," Ulrik replied mildly, though every muscle in his body was coiled for action. 12 years is a long time to forget old lessons. "Not that long," Magnus countered, signaling his remaining man to circle behind their captive. "Not when those lessons were written in blood and brotherhood. You remember the old ways, Ulrik Eriksson. You remember what it means to be a prince. I remember what it costs to be one." And what did it cost? Magnus's voice carried mockery and genuine curiosity in equal measure. Crown, throne, the respect of your peers, seems like a high price for the love of a fat merchant's daughter. The insult to Astrid's memory hit like a physical blow, but Ulrik kept his expression neutral. Anger was what Magnus wanted, emotion that would cloud judgment and create opportunities for exploitation. "It cost me nothing I couldn't afford to lose," he said instead. "Unlike some men, I learned to distinguish between what I wanted and what I needed." "And what do you need now, my prince?" "To get Freya home safely." "Ah, but that's where things become complicated." Magnus smiled, pressing his blade against Freya's throat, hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "You see, I need something from you as well. Something that requires more than your death to achieve. I won't be your puppet king, won't you?" The Jarl's expression was supremely confident. "Not even to save the woman you love? Not even when the alternative is watching her die slowly while you stand helpless?" The wooden wolf pressed sharp edges into Ulrik's palm as his fist tightened around it. This was the moment Magnus had been building toward, the choice between personal happiness and political responsibility, between the man he had become and the prince he was born to be. "What exactly are you offering?" he asked quietly. "A return to your birthright. Your brother's rule has been a disaster. Failed crops, lost battles, rebellions in 3 provinces. The Jarls grow restless, the people suffer, and the gods show their displeasure through storm and famine. And you think my return would change that?" "I think your return would give men like me the opportunity to change it," Magnus replied, with brutal honesty. "You were always too idealistic for politics, too concerned with honor and justice and other luxuries. But you're also legitimate, respected, and most importantly, grateful to those who help restore you to power." The political calculus was transparent enough. Magnus and his allies would use Ulrik's name and bloodline to justify their seizure of power, then manipulate his sense of duty to achieve their own goals. The gentle king would be their front man, while harder men made the real decisions. "And if I refuse, then you watch the woman you love die, and I find another way to claim what I want. Perhaps your brother will prove more reasonable when faced with open rebellion. Perhaps not. Either way, my goals will be achieved." Freya met his eyes across the flickering firelight, and Ulrik saw something there that took his breath away. Not fear for herself, but concern for him. Even with a blade at her throat, even facing death, she was worried about what this choice would cost him. "Don't," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me. Don't become something you're not." Magnus laughed at her words. "Touching, but ultimately irrelevant. He's already decided, haven't you, my prince? Love makes the choice for him." But as Ulrik looked into Freya's eyes, he saw something Magnus had missed. Not just love, but absolute trust in his ability to find another way. She believed in him, not as a prince or a political symbol, but as the man who had chosen compassion over ambition, who had built a life of meaning from the ashes of royal disappointment. And in that moment of perfect understanding, he found his answer. The wooden wolf flew from his hand with deadly precision, striking Magnus in the temple with enough force to stagger him. In the split second of confusion that followed, Ulrik moved with the fluid grace of a man who had never truly forgotten how to be dangerous. His sword appeared in his hands, as if conjured from thin air, the blade singing as it cleared its scabbard. The remaining raider died before he could draw his own weapon, cut down by an arc of steel that seemed to split the very air. Magnus recovered quickly, his own blade rising to meet Ulrik's attack, but the advantage of surprise was already lost. They circled each other in the firelight like wolves testing for weakness. Steel ringing against steel in a deadly dance both men had learned in their youth. "You were always the better swordsman," Magnus admitted through gritted teeth as he parried a thrust that would have opened his throat. "But skill alone won't save you now." "No," Ulrik agreed, pressing his attack with relentless precision. "But it's a start." The battle raged in the narrow space between fire and darkness, two men fighting not just for victory, but for the right to define what the future would hold. Behind them, Freya worked frantically at the ropes that bound her, adding her own desperate efforts to his. This was the moment everything balanced on, not just their lives, but the life they had built together, and the choices that would determine whether love could triumph over ambition, whether two wounded souls could forge something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. The carved wooden wolf lay forgotten in the dirt, but its lesson remained. Sometimes the pack was just two, people who refused to abandon each other, no matter what the cost. The braided rope of her own hair fell to the ground like a severed chain, dark strands catching the firelight as they scattered across the rocky earth. Freya's hands shook as she worked, using the knife she had managed to free from Magnus's belt during the confusion of battle. The blade was sharp enough to cut through the thick bonds that held her, but more importantly, it had given her something she had never possessed before, the power to free herself. The transformation was more than physical. As her hair fell away, in long, thick plaits, Freya felt years of shame and self-doubt falling with it. Her father had always criticized her appearance, had made her believe that her worth was tied to meeting others' expectations of feminine beauty. But now, soaring through the rope with desperate efficiency, she understood that beauty had nothing to do with conforming to someone else's vision. Beauty was in the fierce determination that drove her to keep cutting even as the battle raged mere steps away. Beauty was in the love that made her risk everything to help the man who had shown her what it meant to be valued. Beauty was in the courage she was discovering in herself, courage she had never known she possessed. "Behind you," she shouted as Magnus feinted left and struck right, nearly catching Ulrik off guard. Her warning came just in time, allowing him to pivot and catch the blade on his sword's crossguard. The two men separated, circling each other with the predatory grace of experienced killers. But Freya could see what Magnus perhaps could not. Ulrik was not fighting as the prince he had once been, driven by duty and political necessity. He was fighting as the man he had become, motivated by something far more powerful than royal obligation. He was fighting for home. "You cannot win this," Magnus snarled, pressing forward with a series of rapid strikes that forced Ulrik back toward the fire's edge. "Even if you kill me, more will come. The kingdom bleeds, and men like me will always seek to profit from that bleeding. Then I'll kill them too," Ulrik replied with calm certainty, his blade moving in defensive patterns that spoke of decades of training. "As many as it takes." For her, Magnus glanced toward Freya with contempt. For a woman who isn't even beautiful by any reasonable standard? This is what the noble Prince Ulrik has reduced himself to? The insult hit its mark, but not in the way Magnus intended. Instead of enraging Ulrik, it seemed to center him, to remind him of exactly what he was fighting to protect. "You're right," he said quietly, and something in his tone made both Freya and Magnus freeze. "She's not beautiful by your standards, or by the standards of men who see women as objects to be acquired and displayed." His swordwork never paused, but his voice carried clearly over the ring of steel on steel. "But she's beautiful in ways you could never understand. Beautiful in her kindness to frightened animals, in her skill at healing, in her ability to find joy in simple things like sunrise over mountains or bread baking in an oven." Freya felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. No one had ever defended her like this, had ever articulated her worth in terms that had nothing to do with conventional attractiveness. "She's beautiful in her courage," Ulrik continued, driving Magnus back with renewed vigor, "in her determination to build something meaningful from a life that began with rejection and abandonment. She's beautiful in her ability to love completely, without reservation, without conditions. Sentiment, Magnus spat, but his breathing was becoming labored. Pretty words won't change the fact that she's everything I never knew I needed, Ulrik cut him off. And I'll die before I let men like you destroy what we've built together. The final exchange came with lightning speed. Magnus, desperate and growing tired, overextended himself in a lunge aimed at Ulrik's heart. But the prince-turned-farmer had been waiting for exactly such an opening. He sidestepped with fluid grace, letting Magnus's momentum carry him past, then brought his sword around in an arc that ended the Jarl's threat forever. Magnus fell without a sound, his ambitious dreams dying with him in the dirt of a remote mountain valley. The bloodied ring rolled from his lifeless fingers, coming to rest near the scattered strands of Freya's discarded hair. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the dying fire and the harsh breathing of two people who had survived. Something that should have destroyed them. Then Ulrik was moving, his sword forgotten as he rushed to Freya's side. "Are you hurt?" His hands were gentle as they checked her for injuries, his touch reverent as if he were handling something precious and fragile. "No," she managed, though her voice shook with delayed reaction. "But Ulrik, the things he said about your past, about who you really are." "Are you afraid of me now?" he asked quietly. "Now that you know I'm not just a simple farmer seeking peace in the mountains?" Freya looked at him, really looked at him, and saw both the prince he had been and the man he had chosen to become. The noble bearing had always been there beneath the humble exterior, the natural authority that made people trust and follow him. But so had the gentleness, the genuine care for others, the desire to build rather than destroy. "I was never afraid of the farmer," she said softly, raising her hand to touch his face. "And I'm not afraid of the prince. I'm afraid of losing the man who chose to be both." He caught her hand and pressed it against his cheek, his eyes closing, as if her touch could heal wounds deeper than any sword could make. "You won't lose me. Whatever comes next, whatever choices we have to make, we'll make them together." Together. She agreed and felt the rightness of the word settle into her bones. They rose as one, looking down at the carnage around them. 6 men had died tonight, and with them had died the simple life they had built in their mountain sanctuary. News of this battle would spread, would draw attention they had hoped never to face again. "We can't go back, can we?" Freya asked, though she already knew the answer. "No," Ulrik confirmed. "Magnus was right about one thing. More will come. Men seeking to use my name for their own purposes, enemies of my brother looking to eliminate. A potential threat, curiosity seekers drawn by tales of the exiled prince." "Then what do we do?" Ulrik picked up the bloodied ring, turning it in his fingers as he had once turned the wooden wolf. But where the carved totem had spoken of pack loyalty and protection, this silver band spoke of duty and responsibility that stretched far beyond personal happiness. "We finish what we started," he said finally. "We find a way to build the life we want while protecting the people who depend on us. We become what we need to become, not what others expect us to be." Freya nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for further words. The girl who had once been sold as a burden had become a woman who chose her own path. The prince who had once walked away from a throne had become a man who could rule on his own terms. Together, they began to plan for a future that would be unlike anything either had imagined when they first met in her father's cottage. It would be dangerous, complicated, filled with challenges that would test every ounce of strength they possessed, but it would be theirs, built from love and defended by courage, sustained by the unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The rope of severed hair lay forgotten in the dirt, a symbol of everything Freya had been willing to sacrifice to claim her freedom. But the real transformation had nothing to do with physical appearance and everything to do with the recognition of her own worth. She was no longer the daughter no one wanted. She was the woman someone had chosen to defend with his life, the healer whose skills brought hope to the suffering, the partner whose love had redeemed a warrior's wounded heart. And that, she realized, was beautiful beyond any conventional measure. The shared blade passed between them like a sacred trust, Ulrik's battle-worn knife becoming an extension of both their wills as the final confrontation unfolded. What neither of them had expected was that Magnus had been only the advance guard. The true test of their resolve came with the dawn, when 20 armed men crested the valley's rim like wolves, scenting blood. Harald's men, Ulrik identified, grimly, recognizing the banners even at a distance. My brother didn't wait for Magnus to succeed or fail. He sent his own hunting party. Freya's heart clenched as she watched the disciplined formation advancing down the slope. These weren't ambitious jarls seeking personal gain. These were royal guards following orders, professional soldiers who would show no mercy to a prince they viewed as a traitor to the crown. "They'll kill us both," she whispered. "Not if we're smarter than they are." Ulrik's voice carried the calm authority of a man who had commanded armies, but his eyes were already calculating odds and terrain. Magnus chose this valley for defense, but he thought like a raider. We need to think like survivors. The shared knife gleamed in the morning light as he pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around the worn leather grip. "Remember everything I taught you. Strike fast, strike true, and never hesitate when life depends on action. I won't leave you to face them alone, and I won't let you die for my sins." His smile was fierce and tender all at once. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." The first arrows began to fall as they took cover behind the rocky outcropping where Magnus had made his final stand. Ulrik's warbow sang in response, each shot finding its mark with deadly precision. But 20 against 2 were odds that skill alone couldn't overcome. "The horses!" Freya said suddenly, pointing to where the raiders' mounts were still tethered. "If we can reach them, too far in the open, they'd cut us down before we made it halfway." But Freya was already moving, the knife balanced in her, and as she had seen him do countless times during their training sessions. The first guard who tried to intercept her discovered that the soft merchant's daughter was gone, replaced by a woman who fought with the desperate fury of someone defending everything she had ever loved. The blade found the gap in his armor with surgical precision, and he fell without a sound. The second guard managed a shout of warning before her follow-up strike opened his throat. By the time Ulrik realized what she was attempting, she had already cleared a path to the horses. "You magnificent, impossible woman," he breathed, then raised his voice in a battlefield roar that echoed off the valley walls. "For Nordmark, for honor, for home." The battle cry served dual purposes. It confused the royal guards who had expected to face a coward hiding in exile, and it covered the sound of hoofbeats as Freya reached the horses and began cutting their tethers. What followed was the most desperate fighting of Ulrik's long and violent life. Outnumbered 10-1, surrounded by enemies who gave no quarter, he fell back on every lesson learned in decades of warfare. But this time, he wasn't fighting for conquest or political advantage. He was fighting for the woman who had taught him that love was worth any sacrifice, who had shown him that a life built on kindness was stronger than any throne built on fear. The shared knife returned to him in the hands of the woman who had become his equal in all things. Together, they carved a path through the royal guards with movements that seemed choreographed by destiny itself. Where he struck with the power of a warrior prince, she followed with the precision of a healer who knew exactly where to cut to end suffering quickly. "This ends now, brother." The voice that cut through the chaos belonged to Crown Prince Hakon himself, who stepped into the circle of carnage with the casual arrogance of a man who had never doubted his right to rule. He was everything Ulrik was not, soft where his brother was hard, cruel where Ulrik was kind, small in spirit where the exiled prince was noble. "Hello, Hakon," Ulrik straightened slowly, blood on his sword and weariness in his bones. "You look well for a man whose kingdom crumbles around him." "My kingdom endures," Hakon replied with forced confidence. "It's only missing a few troublesome pieces that need to be removed, like the brother who walked away rather than serve a tyrant, like the brother who thinks he can hide in the mountains while better men do the hard work of ruling." Hakon's blade whispered from its scabbard, the steel bright with promise of final resolution. "I gave you exile instead of execution 12 years ago. That mercy ends today." They circled each other in the growing light, two princes whose paths had diverged so completely they might have been strangers rather than brothers. Hakon moved with the fluid grace of a man who had trained daily in the arts of combat, but Ulrik could see the softness beneath the skill, the hesitation of someone who had rarely faced death himself, who had sent others to do his killing. "You were always father's favorite," Hakon said, his voice bitter with old resentments. "The noble son, the one who cared about justice and honor and all those pretty ideals that make for good songs but poor governance. I was the son who remembered that a king serves his people, not the reverse." Ulrik's blade moved in defensive patterns, patient and controlled. "Tell me, brother, how many villages have burned to feed your ambitions? How many innocents have died to secure your throne?" "As many as necessary." The admission came without shame or regret. "Power requires sacrifice, and if I must choose between my comfort and that of peasants I'll never meet, the choice is simple. And that's why you'll never be worthy of the crown you stole." Hakon's attack came with lightning speed, driven by years of frustration and jealousy. But Ulrik had been fighting for his life since before dawn, had pushed himself beyond the limits of endurance for the woman he loved. Raw desperation gave him edges that courtly training could never match. The brothers' blades met with a ring that echoed across the valley, steel singing against steel in a deadly duet. They were evenly matched in skill, but not in motivation. Hakon fought to eliminate a threat to his power. Ulrik fought to protect everything that gave his life meaning. "She's made you weak," Hakon panted between exchanges, nodding toward Freya, who watched from her defensive position among the rocks. The great warrior prince, reduced to playing house with a peasant woman who couldn't catch a husband in her own village. "She's made me strong in ways you could never understand," Ulrik replied, pressing his advantage as his brother's words revealed the depth of his misunderstanding. "Strength isn't in taking what you want, it's in protecting what you love. Pretty words won't save you." "No," Ulrik agreed, "but they'll make dying for them worthwhile." The final exchange came when Hakon, frustrated by his brother's defense, overcommitted to a thrust aimed at Ulrik's heart. It was the same mistake Magnus had made, driven by the same arrogance that assumed victory was inevitable. Ulrik sidestepped with practiced grace, caught his brother's blade on his crossguard, and drove his pommel into Hakon's temple with devastating force. The crown prince dropped like a felled tree, his sword clattering across the rocks. For a moment, the valley fell silent except for the labored breathing of exhausted combatants. The surviving royal guards looked between their fallen prince and the exile they had come to kill, uncertain whether to continue fighting or surrender to a man who might now be their rightful king. "It's over," Ulrik announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Any man who wishes to leave can do so with safe passage. Any who wish to serve can bend the knee and swear new oaths. But the killing ends now." One by one, the surviving guards laid down their weapons. They were professional soldiers, not fanatics, and they recognized the shift in power that had just occurred. Some melted away into the mountain passes, seeking their fortunes elsewhere. Others, perhaps remembering stories of the prince who had once treated his men with respect and honor, knelt in the ancient gesture of fealty. Freya emerged from the rocks, the shared knife still clutched in her bloodied hands. She had killed men today, something she had never imagined possible when she was the frightened girl in her father's cottage. But she felt no shame in it, only the grim satisfaction of someone who had defended what mattered most. "Is he dead?" she asked, looking down at Hakon's motionless form. "No," Ulrik replied after checking for a pulse, "but he'll wish he were when he wakes. The blow should scramble his wits for weeks, maybe months, long enough for us to decide what comes next." What does come next? The question carried the weight of their entire future. You're the rightful king now, whether you want to be or not. Ulrik looked around the valley where they had just fought for their lives, then up at the mountain peaks that had sheltered their love, finally settling his gaze on the woman who had transformed his understanding of what truly mattered. "Now we go home," he said simply. "We tend our wounded, we bury our dead, and we figure out how to build the kind of kingdom worth fighting for." Together, he reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of two souls that had found their perfect match. The shared knife lay forgotten in the dirt, its purpose served, its lesson learned. "Always together," he promised. "Whatever throne awaits us, whatever challenges come, we'll face them as we faced this, side by side, each making the other stronger." As they began the long journey home, neither looked back at the carnage they were leaving behind. The past was written in blood and brotherhood, in exile and redemption, in the slow transformation of two wounded hearts learning to trust in love. The future stretched ahead, like an unwritten song, full of possibilities they had earned with courage and sealed with sacrifice. And somewhere in the distance, their mountain sanctuary waited to welcome them home, not as the farmer and the burden, but as the king and queen who had chosen each other above all the glittering prizes the world had to offer. The new wedding ring caught the afternoon light as Ulrik slipped it onto Freya's finger, the simple silver band he had crafted himself gleaming like captured starlight. Unlike the elaborate royal jewelry that filled the treasury of Nordmark, this ring spoke of something far more precious, a love freely chosen and freely given, sealed not with political necessity, but with the quiet certainty of two hearts that had found their home in each other. 6 months had passed since the battle in the valley, 6 months of rebuilding not just their mountain sanctuary, but their entire understanding of what it meant to rule. The homestead had been transformed once again, but this time into something neither exile's retreat nor royal palace. It had become the heart of a kingdom built on entirely new principles. "Do you, Ulrik Eriksson, take this woman as your queen and equal partner, to stand beside you in joy and sorrow, in peace and conflict, for all the days of your life." The old priest's words carried across the courtyard where their friends and allies had gathered for the ceremony. These were not the elaborate courtiers who had once filled Hakon's hall, but farmers and healers, former warriors seeking redemption, and refugees who had found sanctuary in the kingdom that Ulrik and Freya were building together. "I do," Ulrik replied, his voice steady and clear. "Before these witnesses and the gods who watch over us, I choose Freya as my partner in all things." She felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to the simple words that carried such weight. A year ago, she had been a burden no one wanted, convinced of her own worthlessness and resigned to a life of increasing bitterness. Now she stood as an equal beside a man who had given up one throne to claim a different kind of power, the power to heal, to protect, to transform suffering into hope. "And do you, Freya, Harald's daughter, take this man as your king and equal partner, to stand beside him in joy and sorrow, in peace and conflict, for all the days of your life?" "I do," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Before these witnesses and the gods who watch over us, I choose Ulrik as my partner in all things." The ring slipped onto her finger with perfect ease, as if it had been waiting all her life to find its proper place. Like everything Ulrik made, it was both simple and beautiful, practical, yet somehow precious beyond measure. Then, by the old laws and the new hopes, I pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen, partners in the great work of building something better than what came before. The celebration that followed was unlike any royal wedding in memory. There were no elaborate feasts or political alliances sealed through marriage contracts. Instead, there was music played on simple instruments, food shared from common tables, and stories told around fires that warmed both body and spirit. As the evening deepened and the festivities continued, Ulrik and Freya found themselves walking the familiar paths of their mountain home, marveling at how much had changed since they first arrived here, as strangers brought together by circumstance and desperation. "Do you miss it?" Freya asked, as they paused at the grove where Astrid lay buried, her grave now tended with the same care that had once graced her gardens. "The simplicity of before, when we were just two people learning to care for each other?" "Sometimes," Ulrik admitted, settling beside her on the stone bench he had built for quiet contemplation. There was peace in that simplicity, comfort in knowing that our choices affected only ourselves, and now every decision ripples out to touch hundreds of lives. "Thousands," he corrected gently. "Word of our kingdom spreads farther each month, people seeking something different, something better than the endless cycle of conquest and submission." The kingdom they were building bore little resemblance to traditional Norse realms. Instead of wealth accumulated through raids and tribute, they focused on healing and craftsmanship, on turning the skills of war toward the preservation of life. Former warriors learned to tend crops and craft beautiful objects. Refugees found not just shelter, but purpose, contributing their skills to a community that valued each person's unique gifts. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would think," Freya mused, unconsciously touching the silver ring that marked her transformation from unwanted daughter to beloved queen. "If he could see what became of the burden he sold away." "I think," Ulrik said carefully, "that he would struggle to understand it. Some people can only see worth in terms of traditional measures. Beauty, wealth, the kind of power that comes from making others afraid. Do you think he was wrong about me? All those years of being told I was worthless, unmarriageable, a disappointment?" Ulrik turned to face her fully, his hands framing her face with the same gentle reverence he had shown since their first tentative moments of connection. "Your father was wrong about everything that matters. He saw your physical form and missed the strength of your spirit. He saw your gentleness and missed the courage that would drive you to fight armed men to protect what you loved. He saw your unmarried state and missed the depth of love you were capable of giving." The words settled into her heart like seeds in fertile ground, taking root in soil that had finally learned to nourish growth instead of doubt. "I used to dream of proving him wrong," she admitted, "of becoming someone so magnificent that he would have to acknowledge his mistake. And now I realize that his opinion never mattered. The only validation I needed was my own, and the love of someone who saw my true worth." She smiled, feeling the last shadows of old shame finally lifting from her shoulders. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore." A sound from the courtyard drew their attention. Laughter and music drifting on the evening breeze, the voices of people who had found hope in the kingdom they were building together. It was a sound that would have been impossible to imagine during those first lonely weeks when they were just two damaged souls learning to trust each other. "What do you think comes next?" Freya asked as they rose to rejoin their people. "More of the same, I hope. More healing, more building, more chances to prove that power can be used to create rather than destroy." Ulrik paused, then added with a smile that transformed his weathered features, "And perhaps, if the gods are kind, some children to carry on what we've started." The suggestion made Freya's heart skip with possibility. Children who would grow up knowing they were wanted, valued, loved for exactly who they were. Children who would inherit not just a kingdom, but the understanding that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. "I would like that," she said quietly. "I would like that very much." As they walked back toward the celebration, hand in hand and heart to heart, the silver ring caught the firelight and threw it back in tiny dancing sparks. It was a simple band crafted by loving hands, but it carried within its circle all the promises that mattered: loyalty, partnership, the determination to face whatever challenges lay ahead as two souls united in purpose. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and protective, their peaks crowned with stars that had witnessed the transformation of two broken hearts into something whole and beautiful. Ahead lay the future they would build together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. The girl who had once been sold as punishment for her father's disappointment was gone forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than the love she deserved. The warrior prince who had walked away from a throne in shame had become a king who ruled through example rather than force, who built his legacy in hearts transformed rather than enemies conquered. And somewhere in the dancing firelight and the sound of celebrating voices, the future was taking shape. A future that would be written not in the blood of conquest, but in the quiet triumphs of daily kindness, in the slow but steady work of healing a broken world one person at a time. The silver ring gleamed on Freya's finger as she raised her hand to wave at their friends. And in that simple gesture was contained all the hope and joy that had seemed impossible on that cold morning when her father's rejection had felt like the end of the world. Sometimes the worst punishments, she reflected, turned out to be the greatest blessings in disguise. Sometimes being sold away from everything you knew was actually being delivered to everything you needed. Sometimes the love you never thought you deserved was waiting just beyond the horizon, patient and true and ready to transform your entire understanding of what it meant to be worthy. The celebration continued late into the night, but the love it honored would endure far longer, as constant as the mountains, as enduring as the stars, as unshakable as two hearts that had found their perfect match in the most unlikely of circumstances.